well, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you once again for joining us for Raw Compliance webinar. This is actually our 8th webinar that we've done in the past couple of months, which is pretty impressive. And I just want to firstly thank you all for your continued participation. Without you joining, without your active engagement, these webinars wouldn't be happening. So we wouldn't be here without you. So firstly, a big thank you to all of you for joining. Today in our webinar, we're going to be looking at the cost of compliance and basically the skill sets and requirements of a future compliance officer. And it's something that's incredibly close to all of us. You know, are we prepared? Are we ready to be compliance officers of the future? What are the skill sets required? And how are we seeing the changes reflecting in the hiring needs across the industry? So on that note, we are very privileged and honored to have with us today two esteemed industry guests. Firstly, Kellyanne McHugh, who's the Director for Asia Pacific of my compliance office, and also Mark Joyner, who's the Director of Black Swan Group Recruitment, and he's in Hong Kong. Just to kind of go from my personal experience, you know, obviously from a Black Swan perspective, I've been in the industry coming up 19 years. And without kind of just saying it because Mark's on the call, Black Swan has been my go-to recruiter within the compliance space for a number of years, also when I've been in-house. They're one of the recruiters who do actually find you the people with the skill sets that you need and filter through the CVs before they get to your desk. So I'm very excited to have Mark join us today because I have an incredible amount of respect for Black Swan as an entity when I need them to recruit people in the market. And also Kellyanne McHugh, very well known across the compliance space here, both Singapore, Hong Kong, and the rest of Asia Pacific. So if you don't mind, Kelly and Mark, if I may, Kelly, pass it to you first and foremost, just to give a quick introduction on yourself. And again, thank you so much for joining us today.
No problem, and it's really great to be here. Thank you so much for that intro, Una. And it's great to see Raw Compliance be up to number 8 of this already. So fantastic for your COVID venture, essentially. It's great. Kellyanne, I'm based here in Singapore, although I was previously up in Hong Kong. My roles in this industry have started from internal auditor and IT auditor through to working for Thomson Reuters for a number of years in the regulatory intelligence space. Before I recently moved to my compliance office to lead their business in APAC. My compliance office is a conflicts of interest and control room technology partner, so a reg tech for this industry. And I'm pretty passionate about all things regulatory compliance in particular, so really honored to be here today. Thanks, Una.
Well, thank you so much, Kelly. And Mark, over to you. I hope the introduction was okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate it, Una, and thanks. It's great to be here. We've obviously known each other for a long time. So my background is I started in compliance recruitment back in 2006. It's my first job after graduating. I then went to get an international qualification as a chartered surveyor, and that got me to Asia. And then 6 years ago, my boss from 06 was one of the founding partners of Black Swan. And I wanted to join a business which really cares about the individuals that we deal with and act as a consultant rather than just a recruiter that sends you a job description and if you're not interested, you never hear from them again. So it's a pleasure to be here and very much looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you, Mark. It's one of those moments where I realize that I've known you guys for 14 years.
Yeah, I know, it's a long time.
Okay, so firstly, thank you very much for joining. As I mentioned, today we're going to be discussing really what compliance we'll be looking for going forward, how innovation is impacting the skill set needs. This is an interactive form. This is not a static webinar presentation. You are encouraged to ask any questions. No questions are off limit. We want to keep this as real as possible. And just as an FYI, this is a recorded session so that we can actually then share it on the website afterwards. So any questions, anybody wants any materials that we've discussed today as well afterwards, just drop me a note or my colleague Jay, who's also on the line, and we'll get that over to you. So obviously, first things first, you know, what we will discuss, as mentioned, we'll talk about how the traditional role of compliance has evolved. And again, you know, I've been now coming up 19 years in the industry, and ever since I've started, I have seen a massive evolution within compliance. not just with regards to the size of teams. I remember one team that I joined in London. When I joined, we were 7 people. And by the time that I moved to a new role 2 years later, we were 48 people in the London office, which was incredible. So we'll talk about the evolution of compliance. We'll talk about the changes in skill sets that we've seen over the past couple of years and moving forward. Where do we see key hiring initiatives within compliance? How is innovation impacting compliance? And again, Kelly will be able to talk to us very much in that regard. And again, how can we adapt for the future? So first things first, on the cost of compliance, as many of you will have seen, in the press recently, there has been a lot of discussions around what has been spent on compliance. And in fact, Wells Fargo published a true cost of compliance report earlier this year, where this is, and again, just specific to financial crime compliance alone, 181 billion US dollars has been spent worldwide on compliance. And what is staggering is that only 42 billion of that was spent in the US. 137 billion was spent in Europe. And it begs the question, why has compliance become so expensive? Compliance will always be a cost, but where in essence are we getting it wrong? And we have seen multiple entities that have been in the press as a result of this. Deutsche Bank, obviously on the back of the Jeffrey Epstein case, they announced that they'd spent over 1 billion US dollars in AML remediation. When I saw those figures, I was shocked until a few weeks later when Wells Fargo came through to say, actually, we've spent over 20 billion in the past 4 years, with over 11 billion of that on consultants alone to improve their overall compliance framework. Citibank most recently fined 400 million for basically long-standing failures to establish effective risk management programs within compliance. So it's showing you, obviously, the focus of the regulators in this regard. And then last but not least, Danske Bank. Interestingly, Danske has been in the press for a number of fines, in particular with regards to AML. And over the past few years, we've seen a lot of remediation work happening at Danske Bank, and a lot of very senior people moving, in particular from London over to Danske to make the improvements. And they most recently announced about a few weeks ago that they're going to be cutting 1,600 jobs within compliance, which actually brought with it warnings from staff representatives in the press saying this was a mistake and this shouldn't be done. So this is something we really want to talk about today. We see enforcement action increasing. Interestingly, enforcement action isn't focusing in particular on controls, it's focusing on culture. But the Citibank action we saw did focus specifically on their failure to improve long-standing issues with regards to risk management. So when banks are receiving these large fines, but yet reducing headcount, is that because they're looking at cost-effective ways to make savings, or is it because the cost of compliance is just too high to manage in respect of the business? So Mark, first things first, in terms of the costs, again, from a recruitment and hiring perspective, you've been seeing over the past number of years a lot of changes in hiring needs. Do you feel that a lot of money is being thrown at trying to fix broken controls and frameworks, or is there a lot of money being spent on enhancement and restructuring?
So I think we're going through kind of the second phase of the evolution of compliance from the global financial crisis. So I started in compliance recruitment in 2006, and at that point, the compliance teams were very small, and the individuals did a wide variety of compliance matters. So I think the initial reaction to the global financial crisis was very much a numbers game, and we saw a huge amount of hiring in this space. Big international banks literally going from, as you mentioned at the start of the call, a handful of people to 50, 60, 100, and the big banks, thousands of people. I feel like over the last 2 or 3 years, there has been a lot of restructuring, and a number of individuals have been redeployed within these banks, outside of compliance into first line is one of the areas that they've been redeployed, or into the business. And I think that moving forwards, there is a lot more cost control And that's partly because of the business with regards to the money that's been made, and moving forward, the quality rather than quantity is going to be the key sort of aspect of recruiting in the compliance space.
Thanks, Mark. And Kelly, from your side again, on the kind of the fintech side, and again on the product side, what about inefficiencies in processes? Do you think that's a way in which we can see a reduction in the number of staff as we become more efficient?
Well, we'd certainly hope so, but it certainly seems in most of the reports around the cost of compliance that the biggest burden in cost is still a people cost. It's the number of people we're having to hire into these roles rather than the technology, because either technology is taking time to implement or it's not working perhaps as efficiently as it needs to be. So I definitely think RegTech is an answer and will continue to grow it to be the answer in managing the cost of compliance, improving processes. I think EMEA seems to struggle the most in terms of heavy headcount, heavy cost of a compliance officer, and heavy inefficiencies in the ability to obtain, for example, the largest cost is probably more financial crime, right? Onboarding a customer. And the cost in Europe seems to be huge for doing that due to privacy regulations. So look, I think RegTech can help solve many of those problems, but there seems to be a significant portion of this cost, which is labor.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually something that I find incredibly interesting, the traditional kind of structure of compliance. We do have some polling questions today, so as we go through the slides, the polls will pop up on the screen, so feel free to answer those as we go along. But again, one of the things we're looking at here is again around the required skill sets of compliance officers. And this is actually quite an interesting polling question. I don't think that if you ask someone, what are the necessary skill sets to be a good compliance officer, you'll hear some people saying, oh, understanding the regulatory regime or understanding the business and products and services. But one of the things that we have neglected a lot over the past 10, 15 years is the need for people in particular to be emotionally intelligent. To be a good compliance officer, you need to interact across the board with a number of individuals in the organization. And emotional intelligence and that ability to communicate isn't something which we have found to be actively promoted in training and in compliance programs in terms of how to be a future compliance officer. And what's quite interesting as well is the compliance function itself. We always like to look at it kind of like a risk pie. It's always broken down into 8 key areas, as you can see on the screen. I'm not sure if you can see that on the screen. Yeah, you should be able to see that. And so people do get segmented and siloed into these areas, whether they're responsible for interpreting the rules and regulation, drafting policies, drafting the procedures, rolling out training, delivering training, providing advice, monitoring and surveillance, and obviously then investigations. But what is quite interesting is if you work in a small institution, you will end up doing a bit of everything. You'll become a jack of all trades. But if you work in larger banks, you do become siloed. And again, on this slide, you can see here within the respective compliance areas, how you can then begin to stream it down. And as Mark mentioned earlier, in some of the larger institutions, you have thousands of people in compliance. And the question, sometimes beggars belief, how can we have that many people? But if you look into the processes, as you mentioned, Kelly, around AML, KYC, also transaction monitoring, those alerts that are generated, the process for KYC, the client onboarding, there is somebody manually behind that that's having to look at the client files. It's having to look at the transaction monitoring alerts. And when we begin to get system, should I say, ineffectiveness, unfortunately, the cost of compliance becomes astronomical in these areas. And so one of the things we really wanted to talk about then is we have become holistic. We have become holistic in how we approach compliance. We've also become incredibly siloed in some institutions. And the question then is, how are skill sets beginning to change? We are at a crossroads from transformation right now in terms of skill sets and compliance resourcing needs. And Mark, again, you work with this day in, day out. what have you seen to be the transformation and the key changes in client requests for skill sets?
So we've definitely seen over the last few years specialist skill sets with regards to within financial crime, the likes of sanctions knowledge, which is a very topical subject at the moment here in Hong Kong with the National Security Bill. On the in the compliance regulatory world, the products advisory specialists, and that's where it's interesting regarding the skill set of a compliance officer. I think they need all of those skill sets, and it's interesting, the individuals that I know at a very senior level, MDs that I've placed, have generally had a diverse experience across all areas of compliance, which gives them a good understanding of the business and the products. Other very good compliance people have actually come from the business, so they understand the products. And I remember sitting in a compliance seminar about 6 years ago, and the individual who was the chairman of the ICA stood up and he started off his speech saying that actually the best compliance people are some of the best sales people in the world. Because essentially what you're doing is you're trying to influence people to do something that they don't necessarily want to do, or because it's boring. And that's what's really interesting in terms of where we're at with regards to the compliance market now.
And that's actually a really interesting point that you mentioned about influencing. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the enforcement action now hasn't focused on the controls, but rather focused on culture. And we talk about a compliance culture, and in fact, compliance itself is a behavior. To be compliant is a behavior. And what we have found incredibly interesting is to create a culture of compliance, we need to influence behaviors. And the compliance officer plays such an incredible role in that influencing. But one of the things I wanted to ask Mark is, obviously, some people have been siloed. They've been in much larger institutions where they haven't had the necessary exposure to some of the necessary skill sets, or indeed some of the day-to-day issues and dealing with those issues. How are you, from a recruitment perspective, looking at CVs to see if people, one, have the adaptability, and also I'm sure people are asking you, how do they demonstrate that they actually have the ability to execute those types of roles if they haven't had the proven broader experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I think there are certain areas within compliance which are affiliate with each other more closely than other areas. So often we see, for example, people in audit moving to compliance testing, and then we also do see compliance testing people move into compliance advisory roles. But my advice to individuals on that is always look internally, because you've already built up a sort of track record, and you're much more likely to be able to move from a testing role into an advisory role if you performed in your testing role where you are. Unfortunately, the way the market is, particularly if they're using external headhunters, you know, they will have a tick box exercise, and it's very difficult for me to sell a candidate without what's on the job description to a hiring manager, unless there's two reasons when I can do it. One is when there is a supply, there's not enough people in the market to do that skill set. And the second way is when I know the hiring manager really well and I know the candidate really well, and that connection on that, what we're talking about in terms of behavioral and emotional intelligence, is going to be there.
And I think that's something that I find incredibly interesting over the years. I remember when I first finished my legal training and I wanted to move into compliance, and I walked in to an office of a recruiter on London Wall, actually in London, and I said I want a job in compliance. And the recruiter turned around to me and said, I can't place you because you've no experience. You won't get a job in compliance. And obviously, you know, luckily look where I am now. I've had a number of years experience, but that door does seem closed to some people. So, you know, do things such as, you know, ICA accreditation, ACAMS accreditation, other types of industry exams, do they help? Or is it the actual experience that the industry is really looking for in terms of hiring?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say to any junior individuals out there, absolutely. Anything like ICA, CAMS, all helps to add to the CV. I think as you get more senior in your career, it's all about experience and track record. It's a little bit like, you know, I remember when I first graduated being asked about my GCSE results. Nobody cares what I got on my GCSEs, you know, 15 years later. No, actually 20 years later, that's showing my age. So I think that's, yeah, early on in your career, the more exposure you can have, the more qualifications you can get, absolutely helps. And interestingly, I think I often get asked about legal qualifications in compliance.
Yeah.
And I think that, again, definitely early on in your career, it can help because it just shows it's not necessarily what you're learning in that legal degree is going to help you on a day-to-day level in compliance, but it's the skills that you're using, the analysis, making judgment calls. That's what compliance people do on a daily basis.
You know, I have to say, I actually did find my record of achievement the other day. I don't know if you remember when you did your GCSEs and you had to write this record of achievement. I never want that to see the light of day. Like never. But no, I agree with you. You know, I don't believe necessarily that a good compliance officer needs to have a legal background. But I do agree that the skill sets and the discipline that you get from a law degree are incredibly helpful. But again, we have seen traditionally lawyers, accountants, and even to an extent company secretaries moving by default into the compliance space. But one of the things I've been quite interested over the last few years is the poachers becoming the gamekeepers, so to speak, where the first line, the traders, the corporate finance guys moving into compliance, who are bringing over that day-to-day knowledge of the products into compliance, which is so valuable, and also as well investigative skill sets. You know, what I worry at times as well is, especially transaction monitoring alerts, we put very junior people on these to review them, and they don't actually have active knowledge on how to investigate a crime, a criminal network. And so we're beginning to see, from my perspective, I began to see a lot more people coming from government agencies, the police force into compliance. And is that something you're seeing as well through Black Swan or across the industry?
Yeah, we are. And again, I think that anybody who's looking at building their CV and career, it's important that you don't stay in those institutions for too long, because a lot of clients, once you get to sort of 7 to 10 years, they want commercial experience. So I think they're great training grounds, absolutely. But I think that once you've done 2, 3, 4 years there, I think that's when it's your opportunity to actually move into one of the banks.
And one of the questions that's come through in the chat room, and I think it is a really good point from Kim. You know, she said, I've got 30 years plus experience in regulatory compliance, and obviously with COVID and the recession in the UK, there isn't many opportunities out there. But also as well, one of the things that I've heard over the years is people that have been in the industry 15, 20, 25 years, and when they apply for jobs, the response is, you're too senior. We won't look at you. We only want someone, you know, with 5 to 6 years experience. And even when the person says, well, look, I'm willing to take the job, there's sometimes is the hiring managers, well, look, I don't want someone more senior than me coming into the position. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with those types of issues as well? Because obviously they are happening across the industry.
Yeah, it's a challenge, massive challenge. I think that advice to Kim would be, you need to be as flexible as you can. I think you need to be flexible if you can geographically. I think that and coming out of this COVID world that we're living in, I think various regions around the world are going to be coming out at different paces. I think it's then thinking outside the box in terms of what you've done to date in your career, and how can you so actually a good example, I met an APAC chief compliance officer on Friday afternoon, and we were talking, she's leaving her role, and we were talking about kind of what the future holds, and she hadn't thought about actually setting up a company and using all those years of experience and doing freelance consultancy work, and there's definitely a market for that, particularly there is definitely growth areas of the likes of virtual banking, the reg tech stuff, which actually these institutions, they need that sort of experience to help them, with relationships with the regulator. So, experience and relationships are really important.
Yeah. And one of the things you spoke about earlier on, you touched on it, was obviously cultural differences. And one of the things that I've noticed over the years, well, is people are, especially more junior levels, are very willing to jump ship for the dollar signs. And, it's exciting, the move over is exciting. But one of the things that people maybe aren't necessarily aware of is cultural differences, not just between organizations, whether it's a British bank, an American bank, a European bank, a Chinese bank, but also, moving to different locations and different geographics brings with it different challenges because of working practices. What words of encouragement, or indeed what direction would you give to people that are considering those types of moves?
Yeah, it's a huge frustration I have here in Asia, is that you look at a CV and an individual sort of had 4 or 5 jobs and they've only got 5 years of experience, and I think and I think that's a combination of factors. I think the society we live in now, it's an expensive city to live in, Hong Kong, and I totally get it when an individual candidate moves from one company to another and they get a 20% uplift in base salary. So I get it. But I do think that those individuals that stay in a firm and build some stability, it really helps to show that you are somebody that buys into the company culture. And over the years, we've had a number of people move from one institution to another institution and a totally different culture, and they've turned around 6 months later and says, yeah, it wasn't worth the money. And I think so it's so important in a career. And again, some of the most successful compliance people that I deal with have often dovetailed on a more senior successful person. And that individual, that manager, has basically brought that individual up the ranks and they've kept with them.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's totally underrated. And it's one of the things we actually at Raw have launched a mentor-mentee program for that very reason. Developing those relationships with senior people and having that mentoring and guidance is critical to your development. And I remember when I moved from London, where we had a lot of access to senior people, moved out to Singapore about 10 years ago, that access to people in the market, senior people, wasn't there, and it was quite closed doors compared to London, which was very open. So I completely agree with you. Identifying not just a manager, but somebody senior in the organization that can basically be your champion, your cheerleader, but also your mentor, and give you those constructive feedback and criticism and ways in which that you can improve it is so critical. So in terms of kind of key hiring, obviously we will be looking at ways in which key hiring trends are changing. You mentioned already sanctions, Mark, financial crime. You mentioned the security law. One of the things, and again, Kelly, you'll have a lot of experience on this side, data analytics. We see that more and more coming through as a key trait required for compliance officers. And I know, Kelly, whenever you've been working with implementation of your product into different banks, how are you finding their understanding of the necessary need for people who have data analytic capabilities?
Yeah, it's interesting. When you did the polling question before, I actually didn't rate, or I don't even think I selected data analytics. And the reason why is I feel like data analytics is an incredibly important role that supports compliance, but I don't necessarily think that the compliance officer needs to be, the data analytics person, but absolutely the support of these individuals with these skills is incredibly needed. I think the same with the area around behavioral science. I've had some interesting conversations recently in both of these spaces where the need for scientists essentially within a larger organization as well as the data analytics is really needed to help improve the overall culture and conduct in your organization, which is where a lot of this regulation is going. But absolutely, understanding data and the information that you're presented with is going to be critical, as well as skills in technology in general, because everything is so much more automated these days. I'm not sure where this conversation will go with regards to the merge of kind of compliance and the interesting skill set with internal audit as well. But those individuals that have spent a lot of time in compliance, I do feel could fit in quite well within the internal audit world as well, bringing that business knowledge into that third line of defense, which is always needed. So
that's exactly what I did in my last role. I moved from a career in the second line, from legal to the second line, to then into bringing the technical AML and compliance skills into internal audit. And it was quite interesting. I have had the privilege, and I say it's a privilege in my career, to work across multiple disciplines within compliance, but not many people get those opportunities. And to have those opportunities does require you to jump quite a lot. And so your CV can look jumpy. And I'm not encouraging people to start jumping ship to get experience, but we really as an industry need to invest more in our junior staff. We need to develop compliance training programs, such as, graduate programs, where we give them the ability to sit across not just the second line compliance function, but also understanding op risk, understanding credit risk, but also understanding the products and services. It's so, so important that you speak the business of your language, because you need to go into a room and convince, as Mark said earlier, you need to be a salesperson. You need to convince people that they need to be influenced to act in a certain way or do a certain thing. And it's like an elevator pitch. You have 2 minutes to prove that you understand what you're talking about. And if you don't in those 2 minutes, you're dead in the water, so to speak. So it's really interesting to see how we're evolving. But I think as an industry, we have a lot more obligations to our junior staff that are coming through to really support them. And obviously, Mark, one of the things you talked about already was obviously country movement, local to global, and we talked about kind of the jumps. One of the interesting areas that we've seen recently is a lot of people saying, oh, I want to move into virtual banking, I want to move into fintechs. And again, there is a big price difference between what a traditional bank will pay versus a fintech. And again, it doesn't always work out either. Could you maybe just talk about that as well? Because I know a lot of people at the moment are considering these options, but maybe haven't thought through the whole logistics of it.
Yeah, absolutely. We've certainly been seeing it here in Asia as individuals moving from traditional banking setups into cryptocurrency, traditional bank and virtual banking. And the number of people that I have met who have done a year and then just gone back to traditional banking, it's so different. And it will evolve. But at the moment, it's very early stages. And the other thing so the people that have been a success in that area have been people that perhaps are very senior in their career, aren't particularly looking to work for the money, don't have, their children are grown up and can kind of afford to take a bit of a risk.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, particularly the virtual banks, the package is set up. Your base salary is actually very, very low. I did a deal end of last year with the individual took a 50% pay cut in her cash element, and it was bumped up with share options. And that individual, say her children have grown up, and she felt that she was in a position to be able to take that risk.
And I suppose one thing on the share options that people need to be mindful of, it's not something that's given on day one in terms of the payout. You have to stay in the role for normally a minimum of 2 years before those share options become optional.
Yeah. And again, so I think that the key advice I'd give to individuals going through interview process, and I say to candidates a lot, is it should be a two-way conversation. It's not just being grilled on whether it be technical questions or on your career. It's as much for you to find out what's this business about, what's their company culture, how do they buy into compliance, and where are they at in their evolution of their compliance journey. And that's so important. And it's actually the deal I did last year has worked out really well because it's a very, very inspiring CEO who is really bought into what the individual has gone in to do. And I'm delighted.
And I think that's one thing as well. It's really important, especially for people with more junior level. It sounds very exciting to have a title as head of compliance.
Yeah.
do be mindful that that comes with it a lot of responsibility. And as we've seen the senior management regimes developing as well across the globe, there does become individual responsibility. And I remember a story many years ago where when I did my compliance exams in London, and we're talking many years ago, one of the people I did the exams with was then offered the head of compliance role at the security firm they worked at. And I did say, like, are you really sure you're ready for this? You know, we've just done our exams. We're very, very junior. And the response was, no, it's a credible firm. They know what they're doing. And it was Madoff Securities in Mayfair. And 6 months later, she was in front of the FBI, Serious Fraud Office in the UK, after the whole Ponzi scheme that they've been running was identified. Again, not the compliance officers in the UK, most people knew nothing about it at all, but there is a lot of risks that you take stepping into these positions in organizations that you haven't done your homework on either. I think Madoff's maybe not the best example, because even if you did your homework, you probably wouldn't have got to where we got to. But a lot of these new virtual banks, cryptocurrency, fintechs, it sounds exciting, but one of the things I think people don't really look at is who's behind them. You really need to understand what you're stepping into. And I think Wirecard is a good example recently of that.
Yeah, agreed.
I think it's
Kellyanne, so go ahead.
I was just going to say it's one of the biggest complaints of compliance officers in the time that they spend every day is tracking and monitoring regulatory change, how much time they have to spend on that. If you go and move into an organization, I'm not saying that you shouldn't, but when you move into crypto or blockchain, the regulation is changing so frequently that's just another thing that you have to think about. It is a time suck, essentially, having to monitor all of that. So something to definitely consider with those firms.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things, especially, do you have that experience and knowledge to be able to monitor the regulatory change that's happening and then interpret that for the business model? You really understand the business well enough. And I think that's such a critical point, Kelly. So thank you for that. And also, Mark, we were talking about this earlier, you're seeing a lot more hiring and compliance in the luxury retail sector as well.
Yeah, so and that's due to anti-bribery and corruption, and you're starting to see episodes in the media, and these big luxury brands having to essentially build out their global compliance teams.
And a question in the chat room was about, can we share recommendations for compliance officers to learn about data analytics? I have to say, personally, it's not something I would even step forward for. Math and algorithms is not my strong point. I know where my strengths are. But Kelly, Mark, do you guys have any recommendations for people who want to build this knowledge, where they can start?
I would say that Google might be your friend to find the right course. Yeah. From a trusted association, of course. So if I think about where did analytics come in first in the 3 lines of defense, was probably internal audit. So there'd probably be some significant data analytics courses with the likes of the Institute of Internal Auditors, or ISACA, which is ISACA, the Information Systems Auditing Association. And I would think that there'd be others, probably this stage through COVID, many free online courses. Just basic data analytics, things to get your mind thinking about scenarios and performance indicators, and analyzing things like compensation of your employees, right? So obviously we know that incentives and remuneration is a critical part of conduct. How can you analyze that effectively without data analytics skills? So those are some of the things I'd think of to take that on.
Brilliant. I think also like ACFE, I think CFE qualifications as well would cover that. So we have another polling question, which I believe is up on your screen now, in terms of where do you think our biggest skill set gaps sit? And while you're answering those questions, and we'll talk about the poll results at the end, by the way, so apologies if you think I'm jumping past them. I suppose the big question here is, how is innovation then impacting compliance and hiring within compliance? And I think one of the things we've talked about here, and Mark, you've mentioned earlier, is about being technically savvy. Are we seeing compliance, or organizations hiring technology compliance officers?
Yeah, we are. I mean, not big teams, but absolutely, they are having somebody who perhaps they weren't looking for a technology person before, they now are. So, and we're also seeing in the senior sort of management of the compliance teams actually having a technology compliance person, and that's their job. All they do is technology.
Yeah. And obviously then, Kelly, from your side, you know, again, we all talk about fintech and regtech, but the question is, do people really fully understand it, or is it just a hot topic conversation and just kind of like, you know, it sounds good if you say it because it sounds like you're on the ball? And is compliance actually, let's say, is compliance restricting innovation to move faster because of all of the loopholes, so to speak, that are sometimes required to be jumped through?
Whew. Those of you that might know me, I mean, I've worked in RegTech for a number of years now, almost 10, and I'm not a huge fan of the use of the word, only because it seems to become a buzzword. I think regulatory technology has been around for some time, and I think that RegTech is absolutely needed in its broad sense. Take, for example, the challenges compliance officers have with regulatory reporting. Regulatory reporting historically has been very manual. The tracking of when you have to submit has been very manual, and many organizations have been pinged by the regulators for a lack of controls in monitoring and submitting regulatory reports. That is one example of an easy, quick win of implementing RegTech within an organization. And full disclosure, it's not an area that I work in. So I do think that innovation is needed in this space. And I do think traditionally compliance teams have been lacking technology. We saw it first with internal auditors again. They created audit systems to manage their audits. We saw it with operational risk to manage the risk framework, to move away from paper. Now we're seeing it with compliance tech, and I do think it's needed. Is compliance deemed an inhibitor of innovating faster? I certainly hope not. There's a number of reports around compliance and how much involvement they should have early on in the decisions in creating a fintech or implementing RegTech within an organization, and you should get involved early. There are also some other stats with regards to compliance and the number of compliance officers that have, or teams or organizations that have turned down a potentially revenue generating opportunity because of compliance. And that is increasing. There is this increasing personal liability with senior management, and therefore businesses that could be profitable are being turned down because of good culture and conduct outcomes. So yes, compliance might be inhibiting the business somewhat, but because that is the regulatory environment we are in.
I think one of the things that worries me a lot is that we talk about fintech and regtech, but I think there's a big lack of awareness in the market about what's out there. And you know, it's one of the things at Raw Compliance. We've, for example, set up the Raw Tech Showcase where we're trying to, you know, raise awareness on fintech and regtech, you know, products on the market. But what I find with a lot of these products is that they find it difficult to translate their product to the language of financial institutions. You know, these are technical people who don't necessarily speak our language. So from a compliance perspective and bridging that gap, what can compliance officers do better, or how could they upskill, retrain to be able to help to translate those regtech, fintech necessities, and also then bridge that gap between the product and the business? Sorry, Kelly.
I know you're throwing all the hard questions. You know, I find these questions a little bit hard because I came from a technology background when I did my degrees. So what can they do? I think get involved in the projects early, like in the tendering stage. If you're looking to implement a RegTech, I mean, you need to get an understanding of your business case, the challenge that you have. What are your inefficiencies? What are you doing too much of on a regular basis? What are you missing? If you really understand the challenges you have, whether that be too much staff doing really monotonous things that probably could be done in a technology system, you probably understand your challenges. If you can explain your process, what you do, and compliance is generally a pretty process-oriented business, then that should be able to be replicated as technology. And maybe many of the reg tech providers that are out there haven't been on the other side, and we need to help each other together to get that story right.
I think that's really critical what you said about getting involved early on, because sometimes compliance is the last person to be brought into the room for the discussion, whereas in fact their contribution and their ability to review it, especially from a regulatory perspective as well, is critical. So that's a fantastic suggestion. So I think that obviously adapting for the future in terms of training, we've talked about, are people going to need to retrain or upskill? And I think obviously data analytics is definitely an area that we need to retrain for. It's not something that I would have naturally had as a compliance officer. Yes, I have auditing skill sets, but I definitely don't have, I wouldn't be a data analyst, so to speak. Technology, obviously, including cybersecurity. Mark, you were talking earlier that you're seeing a lot more requests coming through for cybersecurity experience. Is that even something that you can get experience in without having actively done it before?
I don't think it is. I think that you, again, courses, I'm not sure how one would get it, to be honest. You know, I think that, you know, cybersecurity is a very, either you know about cybersecurity or you don't know about cybersecurity. And I think that, you know, you'd almost have to, funny enough, actually, I have a friend of mine who, from my real estate days, who left real estate 6 months ago to go study in London a cybersecurity course. And he was doing something very different. So I think that's the only way. You can't really, it's not really on the job training.
I'll just add to that. So absolutely, cybersecurity, geopolitical risk, climate change risk are all emerging areas that compliance officers are going to need to look into. And cybersecurity and the controls an organization needs to put in place is very structured. I would look, if you are looking to retrain, you know, you're mature and you're looking for some additional qualifications that you could do that are fast and efficient and not too costly, look at the organizations I mentioned. I mentioned ISACA, which is a global organization for information security controls management. There's also, I think, the CSSP, which is the organization for managing security professionals in the industry. They will have courses for you to get into it, you know, basic courses and then more advanced. And just showing that you have that knowledge or the ability to go and retrain yourself in these new spaces will be important. And I should add, and I'm sure this is coming later, but ensuring your LinkedIn page is up to date with all of those qualifications. People look there these days. That's all. Yeah.
And one of the things as well that people sometimes, you know, especially with people that are working incredibly long hours, your network is so important to you in terms of your career progression and your ability to be known that you're looking and to identify jobs. So, you know, think about industry working groups, industry kind of committees, whether it's fintech committees, roundtables, any way that you can get involved to speaking with other people in the industry, sitting around the table. And sometimes it's just a matter of listening to the conversation to begin to develop your knowledge and awareness. And don't be afraid to ask questions. And that's something that my mother always said to me. If you're thinking a question, there's at least 5 other people around the table thinking the same thing. So join these committees, put yourself out there and ask the questions. And for me, on the job training and learning through others and experience and knowledge sharing has been one of the greatest areas that I've learned in throughout my career. Data analytics, we've spoken about. EQ, you know, emotional intelligence and communication skill sets we've mentioned. And it just isn't given the importance and the position that it should have to be a good compliance officer, because if you're not emotionally intelligent and you don't have communication skills, you can be dead in the water, so to speak. And I know, Mark, you mentioned it earlier, you're beginning to see it a lot more on requests coming through for skill sets of applicants.
Yeah, absolutely. Those communication skills. I mean, obviously the world's changed this year, but I had a meeting last week, and the head of the desk was saying that he's really frustrated with his team because they just sit behind their desk, and it's a trading floor advisory role, and it's about building relationships and understanding people to get things done.
Yep, absolutely. And obviously as well, being a proactive business partner. There was an unfortunate time where compliance was called the business prevention officers. They also get called, you know, the police of the business. In my experience, my success stories have been being proactive and partnering with the business, speaking their language and understanding their concerns, and then building those relationships. So, you know, day to day, it's great, but unfortunately, when things do go wrong, you're not going in there not knowing the person, but you're going in and being able to have an open dialogue. And that's actually something that really helped me, especially when I moved over into audit. I had an ongoing dialogue with the second line, for example, who were willing to tell me about the known knowns, the known unknowns. And so whenever we went into audit, nothing was being hidden, nothing was being disguised. And having that proactive, open, transparent relationship is critical, really critical to success. So I suppose one of the key questions is, you know, do we think that we're ready and that we have the future skill sets to be holistic compliance officers? Or do we actually think that there's a lot more training to be done? And I think one of the questions that keeps coming in is that people aren't sure about where they're going to get the training from, especially at a more senior level where they're being rejected for jobs. And again, Mark, I know we've discussed this already, but is ageism becoming an issue with hiring for people who are looking for younger, more dynamic people? Or are there ways, or are there specific, maybe you don't want to name names, specific organizations that do look for that seniority when hiring?
I think the answer to this question is it depends on the organization. I was dealing with an international bank in the last 18 months where they actually brought over very experienced individual from the UK because they'd had, I think they were on their 4th head of compliance in the space of like 3 years. And he's come over and he's built a very good, successful team. It's been a stable team for the last 2 years. So, you know, clearly there wasn't any issues there. And actually thinking about it, there's another European bank that have done the same. And one of the individuals that I actually placed in that team sent me a message yesterday saying this guy is awesome, and he's completely changed the morale in the team. And I do think, you know, you cannot buy experience, and I think those managerial skills are so important as well. So it really does depend on the company.
And if I may, Mark, as well, it's just obviously a couple of questions obviously in the chat room will come through in this. And Kelly, you mentioned it earlier about LinkedIn profiles, CVs. Are there any kind of specific recommendations you could give, Mark, to people about improving their LinkedIn profiles for searchability and indeed cleaning up their CVs so they're more punchy and to the point when applying for jobs?
Yeah, that's a good question. Absolutely. So we are, the world we live in the technology world, we are our own PR, our own, I mean, to be honest, this is the first time I've ever done this. Black Swan's quite an old school firm, and but as I say, yeah, I'm happy to share insights, and I think one needs to market themselves. So on LinkedIn, look at putting in buzzwords. So, you know, when I'm doing a search for a client, I'm basically doing an X-ray search on, you know, whether it be compliance or whether it be surveillance or financial crime. And so make sure that your LinkedIn is up to date. I found it extraordinary that APAC chief compliance officer who I met on Friday has never had a LinkedIn profile. So that is a really key tool to get yourself out there. I think with your CV, I always say to candidates, try and keep it to, if you're very experienced, sort of 3 pages. And 2 should be enough for most individuals. And also make it job aligned. So often somebody does a very generic CV and they wonder why they're not getting interviews. But really trying to focus on on what it is that the institution you're applying for is looking for.
And one of the things as well is, some people have talked about not just people being a little bit ambiguous in terms of description of roles, but also people maybe overselling themselves. Would you give any recommendations there? Obviously, we want to paint the best picture. We want to position ourselves the best. But is there any areas of caution that you would give to people with regards to maybe going a step too far?
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen some extraordinary CVs over the years. Don't be too clever about it. There's some really funky CVs out there, particularly what you've got to do is put yourself in a compliance officer's shoes, head of compliance shoes who gets, a number of CVs, and sometimes they're screened really well and sometimes they're not. So, he might have more CVs than he's got time for. So he's looking at these CVs very quickly. And so it's being succinct in what you're saying. Depending on the market, photos aren't necessary. I think it's sort of just certainly in Hong Kong, we don't really see CVs with photographs. And then, and again, so what you're looking to do in your CV, you're looking to put hooks in it. And again, I've seen a lot of CVs where there's too many words. That's what you want to be talking about in the interview. So you want to be making sure you put a hook in the CV, and if the hiring manager is interested in that bit of your CV, he'll ask about it. There's no need to, write 2 paragraphs on it.
I have to say, I always enjoy the CVs that make me laugh. And I know this sounds really silly, but you do remember them. I remember one time I got one and the email address was something like Anaconda69 at Gmail or something. And I just thought to myself, didn't you think about this before you submitted the CV? But you're totally right as well. Like, some people can be over prescriptive, on the job, basically telling us, I got out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning. I went to work. Give us the whole daily journey. And again, as you rightly said, the CV just needs to be punchy, because when you're receiving through multiple CVs, you're going to filter through them all very, very quickly. And there has to be stuff that makes your CV stand out. I have to say, I also don't like it when people spend too long over engineering the structure and the formatting, because I think you need to keep it as simple as possible. And again, from your perspective, Mark, is there any suggestions you would have about ways in which your CV could be more punchier in terms of standing out, in terms of the structure, content, the layout?
Yeah, so I mean, when we send CVs, Black Swan Group globally, we start with the professional qualifications, and again, depending on how relevant, education, current experience, starting obviously with your present experience. If you've had a number of jobs, it might be worth putting a line into why you left your role. So very quickly, a hiring manager can see, okay, so yeah, he's had a number of jobs, but ultimately, it's fine. System skills, languages. Again, don't write. I find this really funny. System skills, Microsoft Office Word or Microsoft PowerPoint is like, that's not adding value to your CV. Everybody can say that. Microsoft Excel. So, if it's system skills and it's relevant for the job, absolutely put it in. For example, we did a deal last year where they needed somebody with Python experience. So obviously, we were making sure that anybody who had that experience, it was in there. Languages in Hong Kong, Mandarin's obviously a big thing at the moment. So if you speak it, put it in there. Also, right to work is useful, because that can hold up the process. If you're in Hong Kong, you haven't got a work visa, it takes, well, at the moment it's a little bit longer to get that. Interest is an interesting one. I personally don't put interest into CVs, you know, sort of because I feel that can come out if there's a rapport in that interview. So, you know, if you're interviewing on a Friday, what are you up to over the weekends, and then something comes out and that human connection. I mean, I remember my first interview in Asia 8 years ago, and I got absolutely grilled. This is when I was in surveying. Yeah. I got grilled by the CEO for the first half an hour, and then we started talking about sport and family, and you know that, you know, things are going well if that happens, and yeah. So I don't think you need it in the CV.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the key. Be personable and be real, and you know, you're looking to hire somebody into your team that will fit into your team and will not just be a team player, but basically can, you know, this is someone you're going to have to work with day in, day out. And that's something as well that I always look for in CVs. I look to see experience, knowledge, and also interests. You know, is this somebody that will fit in with the other team members? So again, I'm conscious of time. We've just ran over the hour. Just on the poll results today, so the final poll results. So in terms of what are the key changes in compliance skill sets that are needed, technology came out as 77%, which I'm sure is not surprising. What are the key skill sets required by compliance officers? Interestingly, 83% of people said products, businesses, and services, and I agree that that is critical. And that's actually, you know, that regulation and emotional intelligence. Behavioral science, this interestingly came out at 45%, which Kelly, you mentioned earlier, is incredibly important. Do we think that there's going to be significant changes in compliance over the next 5 to 10 years? 95% of people said yes. And last but not least, do we currently have the skill sets necessary to be future compliance officers? 72% said we have some, but not all. And I think that's a very, very large statistic. There's a lot of change, development, upskilling, retraining that's needed. It would be really great if you guys have any questions at all about kind of key hiring areas within compliance. Reach out to Mark and Black Swan. As I said, one of the best go-to compliance recruiters that I know across both APAC and EMEA. And again, Kelly is incredibly helpful implementing solutions and talking about the challenges, especially senior management's regime. I know that's one of your favorite topics, Kelly. So on that note, if I could just ask Kelly for you to give maybe some final words for our participants today.
Yeah, I would just say, look, be positive. You've all got fantastic skills and entered into an industry where there is going to continue to be a need for your skills, and the skills you're learning in your current role are definitely applicable in many other roles in the company. So whilst the cost of compliance might be going up in general, I think that your skills will be needed, and you know, upskilling is always good for the old brain. So you know, do something that's relevant to you. It could be additional financial services qualifications, or cyber, or data analytics, but something that you feel could complement what you already have.
Absolutely. And Mark?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the cost of compliance has shot up over the last 10 years. It's not going away. I don't think we're going to be seeing sort of big team build outs. But ultimately, if you're good and you want to add value to your skill set, you know, there will definitely be roles out there. You know, the reason I love my job is there's some fantastic ladies and men that are just brilliant people in compliance, and that's what I enjoy, meeting these individuals. So I think that you know, if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. You know, just if it's just for a career chat or you know, anything at all. You know, I say no question is a stupid question. So you know, feel free to use me.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. And again, one more question in the chat room again was around cybersecurity qualifications, upskilling for digital banking. What we will do after today's session is we'll actually look in more detail at all of the various training opportunities. I know Kelly provided a lot of links already, so thank you for that, Kelly. But we'll look and see what other opportunities are out there. and we'll put them onto the Raw Compliance website. So the awareness is there. And if you want to upskill, you want to train, please look at those. And one of the things that I would say is don't forget about your personal development. We're talking very much today about technical, but again, we mentioned about EQ. EQ is essential, and also you need to think about leadership skill sets, etc. as well. So don't forget about yourself and your own personal development. And as Kelly rightly said, do something that you love. Like, I love compliance. I love working in compliance. I think it's one of the most fantastic jobs that we could do. Every day is different. And if you have that passion for it, it really does shine through. So on that note, I wanted to thank everybody. Sorry, just one more question. Do you think that CAMS is enough for compliance officers? Not at all. CAMS is a base point. It's a good way to show that you were able to remember questions for a multiple choice questions. You were able to remember the answers, but no, it doesn't show the practical application capabilities in the real environment. So it is a prerequisite in some jobs and for some applications, but it's definitely not, there is no substitute for on-the-job training at all. But there are other qualifications out there where they go in. ICA, for example, is a good example where you can do more in-depth training. There's also another one, the fortnightly eFintech school, which Kelly and I both teach at, and that's great for people who want to get into fintech. It's a free school as well. So there's many options out there. So we'll send you all the details. Appreciate we've overran. Thank you for everybody that stayed on the call. And again, thank you so much both to you, Kellyanne, and to you, Mark, for your participation today. We're so grateful. And again, thank you.
Thanks, Una. It was a great session.
Thanks, Una.
All the best.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Cheers.